Hello everyone, welcome to Equal to, and in this video we are going to see what is a suspension. I hope you have seen the previous video and all the other videos that is present in this chapter. So if you haven't, I'll give you a link, you can go and check it out. If you have, we can move on with this video, which is suspension. So in this video we are just going to focus on what a suspension is and its properties. So what basically is a suspension? In the previous video or the video before that, we would have seen that in an activity we would have taken 4 beakers and we dropped different things into them and tried to mix them. Okay, now in those activities we saw a beaker in which we dropped chalk piece. Okay, so that is basically a suspension. So what is a suspension? A suspension is a heterogeneous mixture of solute particles that do not dissolve in the solvent. So what is a suspension? A suspension is a heterogeneous mixture, meaning the solute particles, they don't get mixed with the they don't dissolve with the solvent, and also they are clearly visible to your eyes. So they're not homogeneous, in the sense they don't mix together well, and you'll be clearly able to see, you'll be able to distinguish between the solute particles and the solvent particles in that mixture. So that is what we call a suspension. So a basic example could be, obviously this is a very good example, chalk piece or chalk powder in water is a suspension because it doesn't get dissolved and the particles of the suspension are clearly visible and you will be able to separate it easily. Okay, so that is what a suspension is. Now moving on to the properties of a suspension, the first property is that it is a heterogeneous mixture. The particles of a suspension are clearly visible and the suspension is a heterogeneous mixture. The second property is that particles can be seen by the naked eye. So it's clear that the particles are not properly mixed together and you are able to see that these are the particles that is present in this solvent. So particles are clearly visible to the naked eye, distinguished. The third property is that the particles of a suspension, they can scatter a light beam passing through it and you can make out the path of the light beam very clearly. So also in that experiment we flashed a flashlight into the beaker and we are able to see we are able to trace the path of the light. So that is another property of a suspension. In a suspension, light on passing through it, it makes the path of the light clearly visible. So that is another property of a suspension. The next thing is that particles settle down when a suspension is left undisturbed. So the particles that they generally float or that is heterogeneous in nature and it's clearly visible, that generally floats and sticks around. But if you leave the solution undisturbed, if you leave the mixture undisturbed for a long time, you will be able to see that the solute particles, they settle down at the bottom of the container. So this means that all suspensions are unstable in nature. They don't have stability. Once they are kept undisturbed, the particles settle down. So the nature of suspension, everything breaks. So it's not a proper suspension anymore. So a suspension is unstable in nature. Particles settle down and suspension is unstable at nature. So please don't get worried about the properties and think that you cannot remember all those things. We'll be revising all these properties at the last once again. Now just try to understand what I am trying to tell and try to visualize that particles getting settled down. So so the particles getting settled down, meaning that the suspension is clearly unstable in nature. Okay. The next property is that the particles can be separated from the mixture using the process of filtration. So filtration is something that we have seen already in the previous videos. So if we take a beaker, we take a filter paper, we try to make a cone out of the filter paper by folding it in half and again in half, and we attach it to the funnel using a drop of water and we try to pour the mixture into it and collect it in a beaker. So when doing this, you will be able to see that the particles that is being suspended in the suspension, you will collect all those particles, you will collect all those particles in your filter paper and none of it will get through the filter paper to the beaker under below. So when you try to filter a suspension, you will be able to collect all the particles out of it. So in this case, the chalk pieces, they will be collected in the filter paper and they will not be filtered through the filter paper to the beaker. So the mixture can be separated using the simple physical process of filtration. That is another property of suspension. Now moving on, when the particles settle down, the suspension breaks. That is a point that you have seen already. So suspension is unstable, meaning when you leave the suspension undisturbed for a time, it breaks. So the particles settle down. So it's not a suspension anymore. And since it is not a suspension anymore and the particles settle down, the beam of light on passing through it, it doesn't scatter. Meaning there are no particles in the space where you flash your light. So since there is no particles, it will not be able to scatter light and thus you will not be able to trace the path of the light. So after the particles being settled down, if you flash light into it, you will not be able to trace the path of it. So this is another property of suspension. Now we are just going to summarize all the properties of suspension that we have learnt. The first property is suspensions are heterogeneous in nature. So they don't mix very well. You will be able to clearly distinguish between the particles of the solute from the particles of the solvent. So they are heterogeneous in nature. The second property of the suspension is particles can be seen by the naked eye, meaning that they are not mixed well. So the particles of the solute, they don't get in between the particles of the solvent. So you will be able to clearly see the particles of the solute. So when describing these properties, you just imagine a beaker filled with water and chalk pieces are floating in it. So this is a clear example of a suspension. So whatever properties you want to tell, just have this picture in mind. Have this picture of chalk pieces floating in a beaker filled with water. So when you have this picture in mind, you will be able to clearly mention all the properties of a suspension and you will be able to make sense out of it. It would be quite easy for you to do so. So just picture a beaker filled with water that is having some chalk pieces floating in it. So now since the chalk pieces, they are not mixed well, they are obviously heterogeneous mixtures, and particles, the chalk particles, obviously they are visible to your eyes. So the particles can be seen with the naked eye. Particles scatter a beam of light passing through it and make the path visible. So when you flash light into it, its path is traced. It can be traced. The fourth thing is that when you leave the mixture undisturbed, when you leave the suspension undisturbed for a while, it becomes unstable and the particles get settled down. And the fifth point is that separated from the mixture by the process of filtration. So when you pass this liquid through a filter paper, you will be able to separate the solute particles from the solvent. So the chalk particles, they get filtered out in the filter paper. So that is the property number 5. And the last and final property is that when the particles settle down, the suspension breaks down and they don't scatter light further. So since it's unstable, since the suspension breaks down, if you leave it undisturbed for a while, it is not a suspension anymore, it breaks. So in that case, if you flash light into it, it makes no sense, it would not trace the light. You will not be able to trace the path of the light in that anymore. So that is the last and final property of the suspension. So that is all for this video. I hope you have learned what a suspension is and the properties of a suspension. If you have any further questions, please put them in the comments. I'll get back to you as soon as possible. In the next video, we'll be seeing about colloids. So stay tuned for that. Thank you so much for watching this video. See you in the next one. And also, if you haven't watched the previous videos from our playlist for this chapter, I'll give you a link. You can go and check it out. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.